was quite an argument early on between guys like Pietro and guys like Richard Hoagland as to whether this was a 4- or 5-sided object, because the early Viking imagery was not that great. However, under processing, it pretty much ended up looking like a pentagonal form. Now, later on, a guy named Errol Torin, whose job was at the Defense Mapping Agency, basically his job was to look at satellite images and decide, okay, is this a camouflaged artificial structure, or is this a naturally occurring mesa or building, rock or some sort of formation like that? And basically he came up to Richard and he said, look, I've got a great background in this stuff, and I don't know of anything that can naturally explain the formation of the D&M Pyramid. Now, not only that, but he sort of eventually said that, look, this thing has a very specific set of internal geometry and angles that to him implied that if you were to reconstruct the way it was originally built, that it was a huge pentagon. Here's the most current, fairly up-to-date image of the D&M. Let's go back to it, sorry, of the D&M. And it does have these sort of 5 buttresses, is what Richard calls them, connecting, all sort of spread out. There's a very weird entrance wound or exit wound of something, and it appears to be collapsing. Now, this sort of caving in aspect is really unusual for a mountain. Mountains don't usually cave in like that. They're usually very rigid, and they also don't usually form pentagon shapes. Later on, under the high-resolution images, there was eventually a second sort of symmetry figured out by a guy in England, and he said that, look, if you take this thing, there's got one axis of symmetry that way and another one that way. If you include this little platform it seems to be resting on. Here's some of the latest images. Again, the Mars Global Surveyor composites. This is the color Mars Express. And this is a 3D perspective that was generated by the European Space Agency with their Mars Express imager. It's really cool because they have this camera that takes 2 pictures at basically the same time. And you can then use those as a stereo pair to create 3D out of it. So, I don't know, if it was me and I was standing on the surface of Mars or flying over this thing and I saw this face like that and I saw that face going like that, I would assume that it was a pyramid. Now, there's some people that have written books. There's one called The Real Mars, where he talks about the D&M, and he's actually fairly fair to Richard in his work, considering that he's a kind of a skeptic. And he says, oh, it's obviously a natural formation. Well, I don't know. If I looked at this, I don't think I would conclude that was natural. I'd conclude it was a ruined, gigantic pyramid. Here's the other side. Again, another facet like that. So this thing, to me, has all the earmarks of something that used to be a pyramid, almost like the ones we have here on Earth, except that it's a hell of a lot bigger. Now, Torin also figured out this internal geometry, included a lot of mathematical constants. And what happened was they then went back and said, okay, let's take those same numbers and go back and look at all the stuff we've already decided might be artificial, and do these same numbers repeat? And the answer was, yeah, that they did repeat. And they got some numbers that repeated very consistently. One of them that stood out a lot was this one, 19.5 degrees or 19.5 degrees. If you've ever heard Richard on Coast to Coast or read the book, you certainly see a lot of 19.5s in there. Well, 19.5 degrees in this particular case has to do with the mathematical properties of an object called a tetrahedron. A tetrahedron is the simplest of the 5 so-called platonic solids. It's basically a 4-sided pyramid, and it doesn't have to have equilateral triangular faces, but it can. That's called a regular tetrahedron, and essentially it seemed to have something to do with tetrahedrons. In fact, a lot of the numbers appeared to be derivatives of this tetrahedral geometry, but not necessarily just a plain old tetrahedron by itself, but specifically a tetrahedron surrounded by a sphere. If you were to take a physical tetrahedral pyramid, especially a regular tetrahedral pyramid, and encase it inside of a sphere, and you anchored one of the points at the North Pole or the South Pole, what would happen is the other edges, the other vertexes, would touch that sphere at 19.5 degrees, or more precisely 19.47. We rounded up to 19.5. So what did that mean? Good question. What happened was that some other researchers later, Dr. Horace Crater, who worked with a group called SPSR, that we don't get along with very well, went back and looked at some of these mounds that I mentioned earlier, and he said, hey, not only did you guys get some tetrahedral geometry out of the stuff that you derived from the other major monuments, but if you look at these mounds, they're also laid out according to various tetrahedral mathematics. And he did some calculations on the odds, and he came up with the odds of about 250 million to 1 against that layout being by chance. Now, these little mounds are really interesting because if you look at them in close-up, this is an image of one of them from Mars Global Surveyor, and it vaguely looks like a buried tetrahedron. So if you look at some of the other ones, here's another one. Again, appears to be a tetrahedron buried partially. You've got one facet there, one facet there. So if you try to imagine if it were to be extended and not be completely buried in junk, that you would see that tetrahedral shape. Now, all of these are about the size of these objects, the Great Pyramids at Giza. So we're not talking about small stuff. We're talking about really, really big objects. Here is a later Mars Global Surveyor image of this same object. And again, you can see it appears to have, if you were just to extend these sides, it looks like it's, to me, like it's a buried tetrahedral mountain. And then you've actually got another one. This is in Candor, Chasma, which is a different area of Mars, that looks like the same kind of thing. Now, I keep hearing from people that, oh yeah, well, stuff forms like that on Earth all the time. Okay, I've yet to see a picture of those. I see lots of stuff that looks like this on Mars, but I don't see any of it on Earth. I'm waiting. As soon as somebody can show me a picture of something that looks like a buried tetrahedron that they can tell me is completely naturally formed, I'll believe it, but I haven't seen it yet. Okay, there were some other things that popped up too, which is that the Tholus itself, as we got some close-up images of that, had sort of a triangular-shaped cap to it, and it looked like it might be an eroded, worn-down tetrahedron. So you had this message over and over again from Cydonia that it seemed to have something to do with tetrahedrons being important. So what happened next was that they did some more observations, they did some more studies, and they found that this 19.5 degree number seemed to be really important if you looked at other objects in the solar system. What you found was that, for instance, the Great Red Spot on Jupiter is a storm that formed at around 19.5 degrees, and it's been there as long as we've been observing Jupiter. If you were to take, again, this is a situation where you have Jupiter's magnetic field is anchored at the North Pole, and you have the disturbance or the upwelling of energy in the south. The same thing on Neptune. Neptune had a storm when they first went to visit it with Voyager in 1989. It's called the Great Dark Spot. It also formed right around that 19.5 degree latitude. And even on Mars itself, the Olympus Mons volcano, the largest volcano in the solar system, is right around 19.5 degrees. And if you actually were to go one tetrahedral vertex over, as if there was a giant tetrahedron inside of Mars, and then go north, you'd come right to Cydonia. So it's almost as if this stuff was all laid out trying to convey this message of tetrahedrons. Well, again, what did that mean? It turns out that way back at the beginning of physics, when these things were very, very early being thought of, and electromagnetics and things like that were being figured out, a guy named John Clerk Maxwell, who did some of the original equations on electromagnetism, had started looking at using tetrahedral geometry as a way of solving certain problems. And what the mechanism implied by him, or by his work, was that if you had energy traveling through higher dimensions, higher spatial dimensions, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, up to a 26th dimension, that you would feel energy or see energy coming out from these higher dimensions in our three-dimensional reality according to this tetrahedral geometry. That was what his very early work implied. Einstein said that his work was the most profound and the most fruitful that physics had experienced since the time of Newton. And that's what Einstein said about James Clerk Maxwell. Now, unfortunately, not everybody felt that way. There was a guy named Oliver Heaviside who didn't like this hyperdimensional, higher dimensional aspect of Maxwell's work. And when Maxwell died, he did exactly what he wanted to do. He said, this stuff is mystical. The scalar or higher dimensional component is mystical and should be murdered from the theory. And that's exactly what he did. He removed all of the higher dimensional aspects, all of the tetrahedral geometry from Maxwell's equations. And so the electromagnetic physics equations that we use now and that we teach to engineering students is all based on a subset, a very small Newtonian subset of what originally Maxwell intended to be a much, much bigger picture. So as a result, we're working with limitations by which we will never unify electromagnetism and gravity, we'll never obtain control of gravity, we'll never have anything but chemical rockets, we'll never have warp drive, we'll never have Star Trek, as long as we adhere to the equations that Heaviside gave us, that are called Maxwell's equations, but in fact are Heaviside's, not his. Now, physics is not my thing. It's Richard's thing, and he's very good at explaining it, but I decided what's the simplest way that I can sort of explain this to people, and I came up with this, actually. I found this on Far Side cartoon, where you've got an ant, being basically, underneath the magnifying glass being heated up, and he can't figure out why. So try to imagine a sheet of paper